Yes.
Okay, great. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with child welfare and corporal punishment in particular?
Yeah, okay, Jason, thank you for having me here. So at this time, I have come into basically my expertise now is parenting systems and child discipline science and the use of normative spanking as an effective tool in behavior management of children. But one doesn't wake up one morning and decide that that's going to be your expertise. That had to come from somewhere. So where did it come from? It was a circuitous route. In the very beginning, I had a personal interest in school corporal punishment, and I spoke with many people on the internet and so on, and we exchanged stories, anecdotes, and I also had an interest in the implements that were used. So I had, in the beginning, written a couple of guides just for collectors and so on. One day, I decided that there was no resource which actually delineated the entire history of corporal punishment in schooling in Canada. So I set upon writing a book to provide that information and did the research for it. And here's where I'm getting to. In the course of doing that research, I came in the possession of a corporal punishment record from a primary school, an elementary school, in Scarborough, that's Toronto, Ontario. And having a scientific and mathematical background, this record having 500 different entries, I decided to program a database. And I entered all the data just to see what kind of answers might come out of it. And the result of that was it provided answers to about 8 questions that seemed to contradict the mainstream thinking against the use of corporal punishment. It actually contradicted some of my own personal views, to be honest. So then I thought, well, either this is an aberration or what we generally believe to be true is scientifically not true. And I set about at that point gathering records from colleagues I had around the world, archivists and so on, and I amassed 13 records from educational institutions from Canada, United Kingdom, and Australia. That was a 2-year project, and it culminated in a work called Corporal Punishment, Is It Effective? And this is, I believe, the only real empirical study of actual records and data. Now, that definitively told me that 8 things that people say to denigrate the use of normative physical discipline were actually wrong, because it robustly disproved those claims time and again. Now, in 2004, our Supreme Court in Canada ruled on Section 43 of the Criminal Code. That is the section that allows parents to use what we call reasonable force. And in 2004, they defined with various objective tests what reasonable actually means. And from that, I believe Canada now has the most explicit and best laws on the planet in regards to differentiating what is acceptable physical discipline and what is harsh and abusive force. The reason I bring that up is because school corporal punishment was removed from all schooling with that ruling. So to have an expertise in school corporal punishment in Canada is a career-limiting move. But I did believe that if at least 8 claims made against the use of it in education turned out to be patently false, then it must also be true that the very same claims made to denigrate or proscribe parental spanking must also be equally false. And from there, I set out to answer what seemed to be yet unanswered questions scientifically on various aspects of the use of parental spanking. And more importantly, on the outcomes in countries that had banned it for some time.
What were some of the most important 8 things that you found on your first study?
Okay, claim number 1 is that it's ineffective. we found through a study of 18,000 enrollees and 10,000 incidents of corporal punishment over 250 some odd years of records, that the effectiveness rate was 82%. So how do you measure effectiveness? This is a good question. The way one measures effectiveness when you apply a method to stop a certain type of behavior is called recidivism. How many times when you apply a certain method does the reoffense occur? And we found overall it was 82% effective, meaning there was only 18% recidivism, where the pupil receiving that punishment would then, within a 6-year span roughly, go on to have repeated the same behavior. And that compares very strongly. I have not seen effectiveness data from real-time experiments that would show that any other method, whether they're confinement types, which are groundings, timeouts, sent to a bedroom, or other types of consequences, such as withholding of allowance, etc., have as high an effectiveness as this does. I'd also like to compare it to incarceration rates. There's great data in the US. There's a study done on about 500,000 inmates who were released to see to what degree did they reoffend within 5 years. And within 5 years, 70% of those inmates had reoffended and were back in prison. So a 70% recidivism rate is a 30% effectiveness rate, which makes corporal punishment more than double effective as a comparison.
So as you have transitioned from researching corporal punishment in schools to transitioning to researching corporal punishment in home settings or in other parental settings, what have been sort of your guiding principles or your key assumptions or things that have put some framework around your research?
Okay, there's a lot of material that's out there that looks like credible research. The devil is always in the details, in the methodology. And this is a very complicated area. It's a social science. Everything is nuanced. Even the definitions are nuanced. And everything that one looks at in social science, there is an exception to everything, and there's also exceptions to exceptions. So our approach is basically that we take a look at a specific claim that is made and attempt to create an experiment which methodology would preclude the hundreds of variables that might be there or normalize them, and try to determine that if there is a evidenced empirical answer to that question. That's the basis of how I would approach.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to take a step back and just talk about corporal punishment or physical discipline generally. Do we know how prevalent it is in any context, whether Canada or the West or any countries? Do we have data on the prevalence either now or in the past?
Yes, so I'm going to start off by saying that the research that we produce is under the moniker of Iron Gate Research. It is mainly myself, but I rely heavily on the cooperation and assistance of colleagues around the world who can provide data in certain circumstances. Please ask the question again.
So, do we know anything about how prevalent
Yes.
physical discipline is by parents either now or in the recent past?
Yes, it's very surprising. So there's a claim being made that over 50 countries have abolished or criminalized parental spanking. And that claim is patently false, because in very few countries, but which Canada is also trying to do, they actually do this by removal of defenses in the criminal code. But in the vast majority of those countries, it's basically a statement placed in the civil code, but that does not have a criminal or legal weight to it. And for that reason, there are many countries that people believe have spanking bans, but in fact they do not in law. And because of that, one finds that even though this is a banned country, the prevalence of spanking is about as high as in countries where it isn't. So I'm going to give you a few data points. So IGR, Iron Gate Research, we did some surveying in 2012, and we found that generally 4 in 5 parents, that's 80% roughly, have or would use minor force in disciplining. And that falls right in line with surveys which showed 85% usage in England, 87 to upwards of 94% usage in the USA, depending on the polling, and 87% usage in France. Now, I'd like to compare that to countries that have banned or people believe have banned spanking. And so in New Zealand, which has a ban in criminal law in 2007, data shows that 2/3 of parents still use it. Germany is also a banned country and falls in that 2/3 category. Spain has a ban of 2007. The usage there is 84%. And let me just take a look at some notes. Austria had a ban in 1989. The usage there is still 70%. So the usage isn't far off the countries where those types of disciplining approaches are allowed. The only exception to that, and this is an important point I believe, is Sweden. Sweden was the first country to have basically criminalized traditional parenting. This is really what we're talking about. You're criminalizing traditional parenting systems. They did that in 1979, and research polls show that still about 1 in 4 parents spank in Sweden. And this is despite the great risk of their child protection apparatus apprehending